All right, Black Tuesday. It was Tuesday, October 29th, 1929. It was the end of a prosperous or successful and optimistic or hopeful time in the United States. During the 1920s, millions of people had bought shares of stock or part ownership of companies. Stock prices continued to rise and rise and rise, and people borrowed more and more money to buy more shares. And on Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929, the stock prices of stocks fell sharply. Suddenly, the shares were worth nothing. People lost everything they owned that day. The stock market had crashed, and the U.S. economy crashed along with it. The Great Depression. The stock market crash was only the beginning of tough times for the country. Many banks lost money too. And where do you keep your money? You keep your money in the bank. And if the bank has no money, you can't have access to your money. People worried that their money in the bank might not be safe, and they rushed to the banks to withdraw all of their money. When banks were out of money, they closed their doors. Some of the banks began to go out of business. People lost their jobs. People who had deposited money in the banks were out of luck. They had no money. There was no money left. Many banks tried to get back some of the money people had borrowed. They asked people to pay back loans, which loans is money given to people that they promised to pay back immediately. Sometimes the banks took people's homes and farms back when loans weren't paid. People were left homeless and without a way to make any money. Many felt the banks were being cruel to them. Businesses were hurt by the depression too. Some lost a lot of money in the stock market crash. Many of them had to cut back employees' hours and reduce their pay. Many people lost their jobs altogether when businesses closed. Within a few years, millions of Americans were out of work. Some of these people traveled on railroads from town to town looking for new jobs. Some businesses had more than 1,000 people apply for a single job opening. Farmers who had lost their land traveled all over the country to try and find work on other people's farms. And then the Dust Bowl happened to make matters even worse. 25,000 square miles in the southwestern plains suffered terrible drought. There was no rain. There were severe windstorms. These windstorms were so bad they covered farmland with a blanket of dust. The Dust Bowl affected land in Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, and Colorado, and that's where we grow a lot of our crops. So if we're not able to grow crops because of this huge blanket of dust and no rain, think about how hungry people were. There was no food or a lack of food. Farmland in these areas had been overplowed and overgrazed by animals for years before. Because the region was also in drought and there was almost no rainfall for years, there was very little grass and few trees growing on the land. High winds blew, no rain for years. There was very little grass and few trees growing on the land. High winds blew and exposed the topsoil away. Huge dust clouds of storms blew across the land and destroyed everything in their paths. Small farms were the hardest hit. Many of the farmers were already in debt. They had borrowed money for seeds and tools to operate their farms. When crops didn't grow, the farmers couldn't repay the bank. Unfortunately, banks often had to foreclose on the farms. This meant the farmers no longer owned the land. Suddenly, many farm families were left homeless and without a way to support their families. Life in the U.S. at this time was very poor.